All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Charles Sitnor. I'm the Senator for District 44. I want to welcome you all here this morning for our first annual Emancipation Day Conversation. I will tell you how this all kind of came about. I've had events where I've talked about Juneteenth, and I realized that in talking about Juneteenth, when I mentioned the emancipation in the state of Maryland, a number of people had this look on their face and they were not as familiar with the history of their own state. So I thought, did a little bit of reading, began doing some reaching out to have someone that might be willing to sit up here with me and have a conversation that would actually also educate our community on how slavery ended here in the state of Maryland. As you all know, I went to Johns Hopkins University. I was a history major. So all of this stuff is fascinating to me because, and I remember there being a little placard above one of the doors in Gilman Hall that said that present history is past politics. And that's the truth. History is nothing but an encapsulation of what past political decisions have been made, which roll into and affect what we're currently going through today. So what better than to really talk about that history on the day back on November 1st, 1864, that slavery ended here in the state of Maryland. So in joining me here today, I have Professor Lawrence, and we met how many years ago? A few years ago, when he was doing some work with the Billie Holiday Project, and my district covered not only Baltimore County but Baltimore City, and his project does some work down in the Penn North communities. So. First, before we get into our presentation, I want to give you a little bit of his background. So he's a writer and historian, Professor Lawrence Jackson. He has recast the study of 20th century African-American literature and culture. He's widely known for his extensive scholarship in this field, which includes biographies of Ralph Ellison and Chester B. Himes, as well as a narrative history of mid-century writers. Jackson's creative nonfiction work is focused on the structural foundations of racism and inequality. He writes persuasively about the historical forces behind the unrest in the city of Baltimore, including mass incarceration, housing segregation, and the disparities in health care and education, and interrogates the discrepancy between the city's rich history and the current record levels of poverty and alienation. He launched and now serves as the director of the Billie Holiday Center for Liberation Arts as an initiative that showcases the unique art, history, and culture of Baltimore. The center focuses organic links between the intellectual life of Johns Hopkins University and the city's historic African-American communities, celebrating the strengths and potential of both. The Billie Holiday Center serves a cultural purpose, hosting regular events to nurture such connections as well as an archival one, protecting artifacts of African-American culture and politics. So the way that we're going to do this today, the professor is going to give a little overview, a presentation. After he gives that presentation, he and I were going to have a short conversation. And then from that conversation, we're going to open it all up for you all who may have some questions that the professor will be able to answer. That sound good? Yes. All right, Professor's on.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, Brother Charles. And we'd encourage people, to move forward because the screen, might be sort of small. There's a little bit of text. It would be great to be able to see it, or it might enrich your appreciation of some of my remarks. I should definitely begin, especially since we're being recorded, and say that the views that I'm expressing today are the views of Lawrence Jackson. Right, the private citizen of registered voter in Baltimore City, born in Maryland, born in Baltimore City. I'm also the director of the Center for Africana Studies, but as many of you know, we have recently received a directive from our administration to separate ourselves, our private lives and views from our institutional affiliations. So I want to be mindful of that. And I would like for you to think about what the ramifications of those directives might be. I also have some literature for you. I am an academic, and you might find like you going back to school for a moment or two. But an article that I wrote about the life of Frederick Douglass in Baltimore City. And I have some of the Frederick Douglass biographies up here on the table. And if you notice, you'll see that the emphasis of the person who was actually born and raised in Baltimore City and whose ancestors were enslaved in the state of Virginia is a little bit different from the point of view of people from other communities who have devoted their work to Frederick Douglass, or devoted their scholarship to Frederick Douglass. But please take a copy of the article, Douglass in Baltimore, take it home and take a look at it. So I'm going to go through, it's about 13 slides. I'm going to try to be mindful of your time and move along pretty quickly. Emancipation was November 1st, 1864. But when we think about Maryland, really, and we talk about the problem of slavery, and it was understood and regarded as a problem. People have written recently, right, that slavery is the national embarrassment of a democracy, right? And if you sort of take some attention to this map, and you just notice that the places that are more darkly shaded have a larger percentage of enslaved people. We can see that slavery in Maryland is a southern Maryland phenomenon, especially in Charles County, Prince George's County, Calvert County, St. Mary's County. And so these are the tobacco-rich lands. Even at that time, people had begun crop rotation after exhausting the soil. But these are the tobacco-rich lands that are producing the cash crop that's being exported abroad. Maryland, of course, is going to make a transition to wheat farming, and which is going to have a lot to do with the rise of Baltimore and global trade. But you're never going to have very many concentrations of enslaved people north of Baltimore City, right? So if you look at the northern section of the state, very low concentrations of enslaved people. And the historian, I don't want to mess up.
Oh, you're fine.
The historian Barbara Jean Fields, who is a African-American woman who teaches at Columbia University, right? She's the one that gives us really what we think of as like the most formidable treatment of slavery in Maryland and freedom in Maryland with the book that was published really many years ago in the 1980s. She says that Maryland's free people, but the thing I want you to understand is that even though you have about 89,000 people enslaved, in Maryland, by the time of the Civil War, you have almost as many people free. So the total population, African-American population in 1860 is 4.5 million. About 500,000 people are free, and about 1/5 of them are living in Maryland, the largest concentration of free people in slave states. So it's a really unusual phenomenon. Maryland is a very different kind of place, even from nearby Virginia, which also has a large number of free people. And so Fields tells us that the free people were, but this is an interesting aspect, free people were not a buffer class between slaves and like the white petty bourgeoisie. Instead, they occupied the same social space as the slaves while eluding some of the measures of control. If you incurred a debt as a free person, you were found vagrant, guilty of a crime, you could be sold back into slavery. Many people, there were kidnapping rings, especially flourishing in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. Maybe you all have seen the film 12 Years a Slave about the kidnapping of the man Solomon Northup, right? He's lured to Washington, D.C. and sold down the river to Louisiana, right, where he has to work for 12 years on a cotton plantation. But all kinds of terrible fates befell free people who often shared the same social space as the enslaved. So even though you have this split, you could think of one large community of black people, almost 200,000 people, almost a third of the state's population. In some ways, our racial dynamics are similar today to what they were at the time of the end of the Civil War, or the time of the Civil War. Baltimore City, and Baltimore City was, the territory was smaller, right, in 1860 than it is today. I often think that, you know, again, I'm a city loyalist. I know I'm out here in the county folks. I know we've got people that have like strong interest in the county. I often think that the solution, or one correction to some of our problems financially in the city, why is Professor Jackson paying so much for water? Some of our problems would be with some kind of different kind of relationship with the county. And maybe not this separation, that in some ways I would say probably goes back to the Civil War. We have some people here who are knowledgeable, but that this separation between city and county is a significant one. In the city, you have almost 30,000 African Americans at the time of the Civil War. Very, very few enslaved. So even in Frederick Douglass's time, right, Douglass is going to come into Baltimore around 1826, 1825. Even in his time, it was becoming more of an anomaly to be enslaved instead of being free. So here's you know, what I was doing yesterday, or trying to figure out some of this stuff. So one of the fascinating things about our lead up to the Civil War and the eventual abolition of slavery, I mean, it really did have to do with schisms in American politics. So it seems to me that it is possible even to make an analogy between this sort of upstart political party, the Know-Nothings, and like something contemporary like the Make America Great Again schism or faction. I mean, it's interesting, there's some similarities, but Maryland was a place where the Know-Nothings were quite prominent. And you know, you have, you know, in some ways an evolution of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is going to be created really around, you know, different political crises in the second half of the 1850s, and, you know, will be launched really with the success of Abraham Lincoln. But if you think of this Know-Nothing Party, this nativist, Protestant, anti-immigration, pro-tolerance, anti-Mason, really, really interested in conspiracies, right? The Know-Nothings think that Zachary Taylor and William Harrison were poisoned, right? They are, you know, sort of alive with all of these conspiratorial movements, which is why they're against the Masons and secret societies, though they themselves are like a secret society movement. And also having problems with what people were understanding as the slave power. And slave power is this aggregation, but a concept really that so many Americans were interested in seeing unseated. But again, the slave power is not even so much connected to the idea of slavery alive in the southern states, but the disproportionate power that a certain group or a small group of oligarchs in the South had on the basis of things like the 3/5 clause, where they get a proportion of representation in the House of Representatives on the basis of enslaved people who are not counted as citizens, but who still offer them, you know, the opportunity to get more congressional seats. And so the spread of the power of these oligarchic group in the South was one that many of the political groups, you know, sort of bustling around in the 1850s wanted to oppose. Of course, the Democrats are pro-slavery. They are very, very powerful also as you go into the North in places like New York. You have even the slave power being so significant at the time that they're able to stop Martin Van Buren, who had been president, right, and he was on his way to be renominated as president again, or Democratic nominee in 1844. But because he started getting, you know, waffling a little bit on whether Texas should come in as a slave state or the expansion of slavery, the Democratic nominating committee at the convention are like, you know, we're going to go with, I think it's Pierce who winds up becoming the nominee. And then, of course, we have the emergence of the Republican Party, known for its opposition to slavery. And remember, not from the causes of the enslaved themselves, not because slavery was inhuman, but rather because, you know, they felt like it threatened white working men. and wanted to make sure that the labor practices didn't spread into other parts of the United States, right? And we have a friend of mine who's the dean of the college at North Carolina Central in Durham. You know, he once showed a series of maps, and you can look at all of the acts that are passed in Congress and notice the expansion of states from the original 13 going west, and more or less the best way to understand that expansion is on this question of whether or not the states would have slave workforces or free workforces. And so all of us remember from our history classes, Mr. Sidnor, Delegate Sidnor is so smart. I assumed he was an engineering major, right? He's asking me questions about this stuff. But I know that you all remember, you know, the 3/5 clause, the Fugitive Slave Act from 1850 is the big one, and the Northerners are up in arms because they see this as an encroachment on their rights. Not so much, again, the cause of the slave, but the fact that we have to be enlisted in as workers, basically, for these Southerners coming north to reclaim enslaved people. You also have the passage earlier of a Domestic Insurrection Act. Northerners are required to put down a slave insurrection if it were to come about, and then in some ways a culminating moment with the 1857 Dred Scott decision, our Maryland's own Roger B. Taney, and this notion that there are no rights that the Constitution must respect or a white citizen must respect of a black person. So we have you know, all of this lead up to the Civil War. I wanted to mention, and I couldn't find, I'm sorry, I apologize, I couldn't find the citation. So I can't give you the best up-to-date information, but anyway, here's a nugget. When John Brown leads the forces to Harper's Ferry to take over the munitions depot there and to begin the insurgency, right, that he believes will overthrow slavery, there is a connection to Catonsville and to Winter's Lane. And so most of us know that Winter's Lane is a historic African-American, you know, sort of strip. And, you know, you just come in just off of Rolling Road at Route 40. And in fact, what they discovered a few years ago was that in some of the houses, they found weapons that had been taken or used at Harper's Ferry. And they traced back, you know, so many decades later to African-American householders there on Winter's Lane. So you, in some ways, just to shorten the distance, you have a community here in Baltimore City and in Baltimore County where all kinds of abolition activism is flourishing. Slavery begins to break down in a lot of different ways as a part of what takes place during the Civil War. Famously, we know that with the success of Sherman's march through Georgia and the South, he will issue in 1864 a field order that will begin what we understand today as 40 Acres and a Mule, right? Spike Lee calls his film company 40 Acres and a Mule after this historic moment. Tens of thousands of African Americans following the Union armies as they go through the Deep South, and Sherman saying, look, we're going to give people basically a farmstead, you know, 40 acres to work. We're going to create something called the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands. But interestingly enough, like here in Baltimore and in Maryland, the dismantling of enslavement will really be taking place because of a lot of the practical problems of so many Southern sympathizers in positions of public power, like the Baltimore City Police Commissioner, like the Mayor of Baltimore. And the Civil War, as a violent series of actions, actually begins in Baltimore in April as Massachusetts troops are transferred from one train station to another train station, the first loss of life beginning here in Baltimore. And one of the responses of Union generals to secure the city was to start to build the fortifications that are at Federal Hill today. Most of these fortifications are put together by African-American laborers. After a few months, one of the generals decides to start enlisting black men into the military. we produce in Maryland the 4th, the 7th, the 9th, 19th, 30th, the 39th, and the 118th regiments of the United States Colored Troops. The American military until 1948, I would describe it as viciously segregated. But it is a segregated military, right? It is a dual military, right? There are, until the First World War, you did not have black officers. But these soldiers, about 1,000 people in a regiment, or a little bit more, a little bit less than 1,000 people in a regiment, these soldiers begin the active dismantling of enslavement. As you can imagine, training men under arms, and it's important to remember that even as the 15th Amendment is passed in 1870, we're only talking about voting rights for African American men. But bringing these men under arms, as you can imagine, is the most formidable opposition to the ideas of the submission that was required to keep people enslaved. And then finally, the point that I want to make is, it is so difficult in 1863 and 1864, that even the Republicans, who had, again, formed themselves as a part of their opposition to slavery, there's like a unique kind of a ticket that is made. Lincoln imagines he's going to lose the election, and this is what brings former Democrat Andrew Johnson, sort of a great compromise, if you want. This is what brings somebody like Andrew Johnson onto Lincoln's ticket as vice president in 1864. Okay, so again, November 1st, 1864, they say in Baltimore, 500 cannon were shot off, speeches, streamers, fireworks, right? This was like the greatest day, the day that everyone had been waiting for. And it actually is the culmination of a series of things that had been taking place again over the last 24 months, 30 months or so. Perhaps the most important, would be this sort of gradual series of proclamations, emancipations, gradual emancipations, arguments for compensation for slaveholders produced by Abraham Lincoln. But one thing that, obviously was a harbinger for Maryland emancipation, the District of Columbia outlaws slavery in April of 1862. You're going to have several ideas produced by sort of the Lincoln administration. Remember that Lincoln's perspective on African American belonging to the American nation state is complex. They are often talking about sending African Americans, freed people, to Haiti, to some part of the Caribbean, possibly to South America, right? It is very, very difficult for Lincoln and people in his administration to imagine a multiracial nation state. Nonetheless, after the successful, it's not really a defeated Antietam, it's more like a turning back. After Robert E. Lee's armies are turned back at Antietam in 1862, Lincoln has the political will and resolve to issue sort of like a preliminary kind of a proclamation for emancipation. However, even when it goes into complete effect in January of 1863, it excludes states that are under Union control but are slaveholding. And in fact, this has been a great antagonism throughout the Civil War. And immediately in St. Louis in Missouri in 1861, you'll have General Fremont issue an order and say, well, if the person is in rebellion, they should be shot, and anyone who is owned is free. And remember, Lincoln is going to say, well, let's walk some of this back, Fremont, and he's going to remove Fremont from command. But we are moving towards that, not the shooting of the rebels, but the freedom of the enslaved. We're moving towards that point. But nonetheless, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri are not impacted by the Emancipation Proclamation. However, what has taken place, and you might sort of know this on your own, or it makes sense to you. History and history books are often written by the people who were on the winning side of the ledger, And you know that it took a second Reconstruction in the 1960s to guarantee full African American rights. Many of us in the room probably think that it will require a third sort of a Reconstruction actually to guarantee the rights. That's why I brought some of the books. I would like for you to sort of take a look. I mean, see what the historians are doing or where is it coming from. And I also have brought some of my own works so that you can get the point of view of again, a black person from this area who is thinking about, you know, what was the past like for their own ancestors, what's the past like, and how does it impact the places where we live today. The point that I want to make is African Americans are not passive. We're not just the recipients of a constitutional change, a proclamation from the administration, national administration. In fact, as soon as the war begins, mass numbers of people start leaving the plantations and flooding Union lines and places of federal occupation. It began to actively destabilize the practice of enslavement. For more than a year, slaveholders would go to Union officials, Union officers, and they would say, I need you to return these people. And there are, again, it was a complex series of arrangements and relationships, but over time, fewer and fewer people are returned and more people left. The great, or what we think of as the greatest intellectual produced by the African American community in the United States, W.B. Du Bois, would write in the 1930s that the Civil War itself is actually decided by a general strike of plantation laborers who ceased to work in the fields and provide successfully the rations that kept the Southern Army fighting. And this is what we see here in Maryland, where the estimate is that something like 30,000 working age laborers leave the farms for the Union lines and began to cause the collapse that prevented the Southern Army from continuing to fight. And so, again, in the words of Fields, she says, not so much the Emancipation Proclamation or even the November 1st constitutional change in the Maryland legislature, but rather the full-scale recruitment of black soldiers and the abandonment of the farms led to the end of enslavement. So, you know, my favorite thing that takes place is on November 17th, Frederick Douglass returns to Maryland for the first time since leaving on September the 3rd, 1838. And so Douglass comes back to Maryland. Everybody here knows about the importance of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which at the time is at Saratoga Street and Gay Street. Douglass gives an address there, and he says, even though this Constitution has been passed and now slavery in Maryland is outlawed, the most important thing that we want to remember is we need the right to vote. If we're not serving in the jury, if we're not voting in our representatives, then we don't have access to power. How are we doing for time?
It's all.
Do you ask me to state frankly just what you, my white fellow citizens, ought to do for the colored citizens of this state? I will tell you without compromise, qualification, or concealment, you ought just so soon as it is possible to get such a measure through the legal form, blot out the law restricting the elective franchise to white men and allow colored men to vote and to hold any office of honor and trust to which the people may be pleased to elect them. Douglass is regarded as the most outstanding orator of the 19th century. Douglass also had a particular message to his black audience. Excuse me. And I know this is very small. This is a famous coda to his remarks. And you can see in these remarks the difficult dance of African American speakers to multiracial audiences. You needed to have something for everybody, but often the message to the two groups would be very distinct. And so he said that it was important for freed people to continue to work hard, to understand that freedom was not the freedom from labor. and that people needed, Douglass always believed that African Americans should remain in the farmland, the Black Belt, that they should continue agricultural pursuits and not flee to the cities. He said, what you need to do is to endeavor to buy land, strive to become landholders. For Douglass, the connection to that was education. Build up schools, train your young people, make sure that they have access to education. We must educate ourselves and scorn every colored man who refuses to send his children to school. People would not send their children to school because they wanted them to work on the farms. So it was a real difficulty. We must educate ourselves, become intelligent and refined. That's when the whites will give us respect, and it's going to require a persistent and untiring effort. If you notice, this is one of what we think of as like the earliest photograph of an African American in Baltimore City, right? It's a south-facing photograph. He's standing at Charles Street, looking towards the Basilica from the Washington Monument. And this thing about public pride and dress, appearance, deportment, how you conducted yourself, was paramount to this group of African Americans who had endured slavery and knew freedom. So Douglass said, a lot is required. And of course, that was the example that he lived. Regrettably, sadly, or maybe as we might anticipate, there was a massive reaction to Black freedom. And the Reconstruction in the United States, typically we think of that as something that takes place between 1865 and 1877, and is where you have some martial federal protections of Black rights. Again, the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the access to the ballot is passed in 1870. The largest gathering, what we think is the largest gathering of Black people anywhere to that time takes place downtown in Baltimore. And this problem with exercising the right to vote came to a head in Baltimore in 1875. At that election, the Republicans were not just defeated, according even to the New York Times, which again is a very, very Southern sympathetic, Democrat sympathetic paper, fraud and terrorism is what stopped African Americans from voting their choice. And in fact, there's supposed to be scores of murders, beatings, all kinds of tactics are used in 1875 to prevent Black people from, again, expressing their political will. And there's another kind of deal that takes place where one of the former know-nothings, begins this kind of repatriative movement with the Democrats who, had been in rebellion, and they, were required by many of the congressional Republicans to prove themselves, sort of like loyalty acts and tests, and, they were not considered for a period of time citizens. And so much of that coming together again was produced by Thomas Swan, who had his own political ambitions and saw it as a way to get support from, sort of broadly across the state of Maryland. So I'm going to conclude with just a few remarks on three of our important figures from this era. And, so we have to remember that there's an ebb and flow to the march of Black freedom. But we want to acknowledge and make sure that we understand the people who were in the trenches doing the work that enabled generational transformation. So one would be Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Now her 200th birthday was September the 25th, right? So we're like, we're still in our euphoria of celebrating Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And I'm going to invite you to something. Make sure you get a schedule for the Holiday Center. I would like to invite you to something in April that will be taking place at the Baltimore Museum of Art. Frances Harper is the most outstanding Black woman writer and orator of the 19th century. Born, raised, educated in Baltimore. She comes from like a famous family, the Watkins family, Her uncle was probably the most important educator in the city in the 19th century, but I mean the first half, during the antebellum period. And Watkins was also a very vocal abolitionist, which is completely rare and unique. And Frances Harper, she married, or was married for a brief period of time. Her husband passed away. She travels the United States. She was a suffragette. She was an advocate of women's rights. And she insisted that these collectives for advocating white women's rights, that they be responsible to racial issues. And one of the things that she opposed, and that you would keep seeing continue to, in some ways, use dimensions of the law to make it difficult for black people to be considered equal before the law, was like the application of what they called the bastardy laws at the time, where black women were not being treated fairly before the law. And the people who had children with black women, whether black men or white men, were not being held to the same standards as white women in the state. And so you have, many of our most outstanding orators and intellectuals and writers, sort of trying to move the society in a direction that would have greater equity. Another person is Isaac Myers. So today, downtown, very close to where Frederick Douglass lived, between roughly 1827 and 1833, at Philpott Street and close to Philpott Street and Caroline Street. We have the Douglas Myers Living History Museum. Isaac Myers was, like Frederick Douglass, a professional caulker, and then goes on to found like a shipbuilding company. And in the era that he worked, all of these business endeavors, right, they were operating exclusively for the benefit of the black community. And it was an incredible moment of serious strife. At the end of the 1850s, there were incredible battles between black and white mechanics collectives, where especially white immigrants banded together and tried to, or might have been successful in forcing African American mechanics from work on the shipyards. And so Myers responded by developing, he had to get the money, he had to raise money to do it, but by developing an organization and network and raising the money to open a black shipbuilding company. And it was an extraordinary effort. People think of it as the largest black company in the United States at that time. It lasted until about 1884. It was really vocal in black participation in the Republican Party, black unionization, and black self-improvement. He set a formidable example for black politics during the post-Reconstruction era. And then the person who kind of picks up the baton from Myers would be Harvey Johnson from the Union Baptist Church. I know we have Baptist Church today, so it's important to include Brother Harvey. Reverend Harvey Johnson, right, he's born in Virginia. You're going to get so many Virginia enslaved people. My ancestors are too far south, I think, to have gotten. They had these counties right on the border of North Carolina to get up so far across the Potomac. So many people will migrate into Maryland from Virginia at the time of the Civil War. And he will educate himself in Washington, D.C. You know how rare it would be to have a theological school graduate in the pulpit, right? But he also has these really powerful organizational skills. And Johnson is going to develop he grows the church from 200 to 2,000. He will launch an organization, this Mutually United Brotherhood of Liberty, right? And they're going to work as political activists and then also helping the commercial endeavors of the small African American commercial class. And the frustrations around national politics will lead Johnson also to begin to promote the idea of this is the 1880s and 1890s are going to launch what we call exoduster movements, where you have like African Americans from South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama moving west, especially to Kansas. Like we often have heard about the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre. The people that move out to Tulsa, right, they're exodusters, okay? They're coming out from the Deep South out to the territory. Oklahoma wasn't a state when most of them moved there. The territory of Oklahoma, these western lands where African Americans are hoping to have commercial and political freedom. And so Johnson is also participating in that. This is one of the huge migrant questions of the era. And he will also be leading lawsuits against segregated rail cars. And he's going to be a member of the Niagara movement. So the line from somebody like Johnson to our, I think of them as contemporaries, and I know that we might differ on this, and maybe I'm showing my age, but the line from Johnson to Clarence Mitchell, Thurgood Marshall, Paul Murray, it's a direct line, right? So it's not a surprise that, you know, E. Franklin Frazier, the really important sociologist, is going to grow up on St. Paul Street, you know, within a couple of 2 blocks from, you know, where the Union Baptist Church was. It was the real hub of black life at the end of the 19th century, you know, just to the north of City Hall. This was a huge, thriving, where Mercy Hospital is today, Preston Gardens, right? This is a thriving black community, a nationally important black community. But anyway, I'm just trying to say there's a connection between Johnson and the people who come after. And so the final thing, please tune in Monday evening, 9 p.m. Find out about the history of one of our local religious institutions. And it's also kind of like the archival work that we're trying to do at the Holiday Center. Make sure that we are protecting, preserving, and promoting local history. And we're so rich in that way. And I would also like for you all to help us with that work too. We don't want to see photographs, memorabilia, letters thrown in the dumpsters when someone moves from one home to another. You know, make sure that we keep the print material record alive and well. Okay, thank you.
All right, all right. You're giving us an awful lot right there, and really helped to frame what I wanted today's discussion to be about. So we start prior to the emancipation or the ending of slavery here in the state of Maryland. Maryland's, and this was fascinating to me because, I mean, in preparation for this conversation, I learned a few things. One, the second Constitution, or the Constitution of 1851, forbid a passage of any law abolishing the relation of master or slave as it now exists in the state. So in Maryland, if the General Assembly had even wanted to end enslavement, they couldn't do it. So Governor Bradford, in 1864, delivers a message to the General Assembly that sought for the passage of a constitutional convention bill. And at the time, the legislature was predominantly unionist. They complied, and they put forth this convention that convened in April of 1864. And it was through that convention that they were able to put something on the ballot to rid the state of slavery. But what I found interesting, I think there were some articles that were written. The general populace, the ballot measure was going down, but it was soldiers who ultimately got that ballot measure passed, from what I understand. So it says at the public referendum, the people voted against it, but when the ballot of the soldiers in the field were counted, the vote swung the other way. The Constitution ends up being ratified by a mere 375 vote margin. And Governor Bradford certified the election totals on October 29th, just a couple days ago. Hence, you had our third Constitution that took effect on November 1st, eradication of slavery.
The point that you raised, right, is remarkable. And I think the thing that most of us aren't cognizant of, I mean, again, when I was a young person, and even I've done this with my own children, you know, go see the Civil War reenactments at Gettysburg or Antietam. You know, it's a remarkable pageant, living history. I think it's very important. But most of us sort of just have the sense that, oh, you know, Maryland was slaveholding, and there were a lot of Southern sympathizers here, and Marylanders must have been mainly pro-Confederate. 60,000 Marylanders fight with the Union. Something like 20,000 Marylanders fight with the Confederacy. So the point that you make is so significant that if you started to include the votes of these soldiers in the field, well, then you're going to have perhaps your most cohesive group of Union supporters. And this group of legislators who are Unionists is a fairly unique moment in time for the state's history, right? And that, you know, so much of it would change once the Johnson administration starts reading back into citizenry, you know, these former Confederates, but especially like the landholders.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they always talked about Frederick Douglass is enslaved. He's owned by a man named Aaron Anthony on the Wye River, but Aaron Anthony works for Edward Lloyd, who had been governor, who was senator, you know, who was like the wealthiest man on the Eastern Shore, a rival of Charles Carroll in terms of his wealth and ownership of enslaved people of African descent. And, you know, they say by 1862, 1863, he's losing like 80 people a day. And so a lot of these wealthy landholders were furious, you know, sort of at what was taking place. And what I would think of as part of the reason why the reaction after the passage of the Constitution was as evil as it was.
Yeah, because from what I've read, you had a number of lawsuits that were taking place under the Fugitive Slave Act, where you had Marylanders suing Pennsylvanians because they were not following the federal law.
Absolutely. This, again, the crisis of the Fugitive Slave Act, which is going to require federal marshal or a deputized agent going into a community. And I can walk into a store and say, okay, you men have to form the posse and come with me to apprehend this person at so-and-so's house, and if you don't, you will be put in jail. And that was the thing that people found, like, you know, this is an impingement upon our rights. We are losing rights as these slaveholders and people with this slave power are taking slavery all over the nation, and we have voted it down, which, you know, maybe again is to your point of the significance and the leadership. I mean, wouldn't it be great if Maryland politicians like Brother Sidnor were like, you know, Maryland has something to be proud of in terms of the passage of the Constitution, right? That it's a national leader in moving in the direction of human freedom.
But then even more fascinating, just about 4 years later, I think it was in, was it 1867, that Maryland then passes another constitution, because you have this group that I don't think appreciates the ending of slavery. So you have members of the General Assembly who right away begin to work at, and I think you talked a little bit about this in your speech, they began passing laws to kind of bring some things back in line.
Yeah, so in the Deep South, the black codes will begin immediately, right? So they're going to pass laws, some of them in some ways, or it's coming together before the end of 1865. But you get a series of, again, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. South Carolina is fascinating at this time because it ultimately becomes like a haven. It's almost like a black state, black state legislature, and then sending blacks to Congress, opening a lot of schools. A lot of people in front of these moving to South Carolina at that time. But these codes are widely available, and Marylanders are noticing them as well. Fortunately, I would say it's a bit more of a struggle, but you do notice, of course, that we don't produce that group of congressional representatives, and that the population winds up in some ways leaving these places where you had basically like a black majority. They leave those places for Washington, D.C. and for Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And so then, in some ways, too, the strength of the population, you might think of it as being somewhat diminished because, we moved and then, we're not able to vote and we can't quite get people to represent us and our interests. And so then, the backlash intensifies, reaching this point by the mid-1870s where, you can have basically mob violence. And Baltimore was always known for mob violence, right? A lot of lawlessness in Baltimore. Yeah. Again, especially connected to political affairs and also financial affairs, banking affairs.
Right, and in one of your earlier maps, you looked at how Southern Maryland had, that's where you usually probably would find your Southern sympathizers. One thing that caught my attention again in preparation here was that we actually had a congressman who was arrested and prosecuted in a military tribunal, Benjamin Harris. He was someone who, from what I could tell, despised Lincoln. And they ended up, in their suspension of habeas corpus, prosecuting him. And so, again, there's always this tension in this border state of Maryland. I mean, one can look at the state song that was just recently made, not our state song, where you talk about the tyrannical acts of Lincoln, but this was passed to be the Maryland state song. You look at our flag. Would you mind talking a little bit about any of this?
I mean, I think I was mentioning to you, Dad, I'm a graduate of Loyola High School at the end of Charles Street in Towson. And that the school, the oldest building there was actually the governor's house when they created the reconciliation flag. So our flag is a combination of two flags, the flags of the House of the Calverts, that's the black and yellow flag, and then the flag of the House of the Crosslands, that's the red and white flag. And two flags, in some ways, represents either side of the Civil War. But the red and white flag is supposed to be the flag, the battle flag of the Confederates. So, I mean, maybe we have work to do. Maybe we have work to do.
But such a pretty flag.
A very noteworthy flag. What I like, or something that I'm enjoying more, again, as I get older, is that the state song was actually, that's connected to the foundation, to the emergence of jazz music. It was played in New Orleans, it was played here in Baltimore, and U.B. Blake talks about the way that they used to rag that song. And they substituted lyrics when it was played and sung by black musicians, especially as they were making the bands used to play up Harford Road on the way to the Mount Laurel Cemetery. And so I would just say, sometimes there's also like an improvisation and an innovation that helps us get past a difficulty or a difficult moment. Of course, the Union needed to, especially Occupy Baltimore, suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Sometimes, I don't know what we'd say, home detention people or prevent them from going to Annapolis. Of course, the governor at one point took the state legislature to Frederick. They had to remove rights because this city and the rail line, I mean, it was just a circuit of commerce for the Confederacy. constantly moving men and munitions through the region to Virginia to support the Army of Northern Virginia. And it was just like a sieve, and it had to be controlled. But some of the people definitely were detained, and that had something to do also with the rise of unionist politicians.
So, in your opinion, again, when we talk about emancipation, I think many in our community, they'll directly go to Juneteenth. Many of us have no idea that November 1st, here in this state of Maryland, that's our Emancipation Day.
I want to get a T-shirt.
Right. So what do you think is going on there? I mean, I saw that if you're looking for prominent parades and things, the Eastern Shore, that's really where you would find Emancipation Day parades and the like. But most of us never even heard about this. Aren't even aware.
It's such a complicated story. We should try to make it a rich story. I think that maybe the lemonade from there's sweet. Anyway, you get to where I'm going with the metaphor. The lemonade to make here is to use the national holiday to emphasize local history and local stories, and we should use Juneteenth to talk about the birth of the civil rights movement here in our region. We should use Juneteenth to talk about the impact of the Civil War and so much of Civil War history. We should use Juneteenth to talk about the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War. All of us should be thinking more, I would say, about the influence of people of African descent, and especially people who came directly from Africa in the 18th century especially, and who are coming up the Patuxent River somewhere between, the northern part of Upper Marlboro or the lower places of Port Tobacco, Nanjemoy, these other places. There's so much more that we have sort of like at our fingertips today, partly because of the internet resources. We can all look up the slave database, right? If you have a sense of where your family was living at the time of the Civil War, or in the 1870 census, which is the first census that gives every African American full name. If you have that information, very, very many of us can figure out where our ancestors landed, and in some ways where they came from in largely West Africa. So it's an opportunity to do some of that work. I think that that's really, really significant because we got to know who we are to Sankofa, right? To make our journey forward. We have to enrich our understanding of the past to have a rich future. And the national celebration with Juneteenth is a possible way of doing that. I am not a cynic and think that the holiday was purely to see if they could bring Texas into the conversation for the Democrats. I don't think that's what took place.
No, and you again during your presentation, I was excited that you had included Harry Johnson, because a lot of people don't know that. I mean, this is a bad man. The Brotherhood of Liberty and the work that it did here in this state of Maryland really was a model about resistance and using the system for resistance. I mean, I would posit that out of his work came the idea of using lawsuits to change the law. I mean, we talk about Rosa Parks and her sitting on the bus and not moving. You had your own Rosa Parks movements right here in the state. I mean, I think in your slide, you mentioned the B&O Railroad, but the lawsuit against the B&O Railroad car segregation. But there was also a lawsuit where you had passengers on steamboats that fought since it had to be separate, they said, you're going to have to make this equal for us.
You know, I think certainly to my own naive perspective, sometimes, you know, we read about the segregation on conveyances, rail cars, boats, coaches, and so on. And, you know, it can seem like maybe a mild inconvenience, but, you know, just relative to water travel. These steamships were a marvel of technology, and of course introduced, you know, sort of very early. They were circulated in the 1820s, and one of the features was that typically Black Americans would not be sold first-class tickets, which entitled you to go either below decks or into sort of like an enclosed room above decks. And what would happen is that in the winter months or in the foul weather, it was literally dangerous. So Black American, I forget his name, who was the first Black graduate of Princeton. He goes to theological seminary. He's from upstate New York. Very, very impressive person. Again, like a Harvey Johnson, but this would be in the 1820s. And who will be a mover and a shaker in the antebellum civil rights movement. He and his wife were on steamship on the Hudson River in the wintertime. They refused to allow them to go below decks. She gets a cold and dies. You know, so you know, you were at risk of your life. So the push to make sure that there was the possibility of equal treatment for equal pay was not just one about, you know, sort of simple conveniences, but also one about the preservation of life and limb. And you know, again, we continue to think of it as being, oh, it was inevitable that this came about. It's inevitable that full rights, we eventually achieve full rights, or it's inevitable that we have a strong sense of ourselves beside or notwithstanding the experience of enslavement. But that's an error. It's actually because of the work that took place and the work that continues to take place.
So I'm going to mention two things, and then I want to open it up to anyone who may have any questions for you, or just so that our audience can recognize this. Emancipation Day was officially recognized as a state holiday in 2013. So it's on the books. It's one of Maryland's official holidays. That's number one. Number two, this whole event that we're talking about with emancipation, Maryland, it was the first time that a state south of the Mason-Dixon line abolished slavery by a vote from the people. So that's saying something. With that, I've asked enough questions. I want to open it up to anyone here in the audience that may have any questions for the professor.
Good afternoon. Great presentation as always. Two-part question. What role would you say, when you think about the Haitian Revolution and how it inspired our friends, you know, around the world, particularly in the United States, how would you describe the impact of the Haitian Revolution and the emergence of calls for armed rebellion? How does that show up during this particular period of time? And the second part to the question, because I noticed on the Harvey Johnson slide, the Texas Purchase movement. And so even though Pan-Africanism wasn't coined as a term during this period of time, there was a lot of what many would describe as like proto-Pan-Africanist activity, and the Texas Purchase being a potential example of that. How much of that also shows up in Maryland during this period of time?
I just want to acknowledge, so we have Brother Davon Love with us, one of the founders of Leaders for Beautiful Struggle, really one of the people who has taken the grassroots concerns, emphasis, and energy to the politicians. And so, you know, it's a beautiful moment to have, you know, sort of our activist class, but then also a political lobbyist among us. So please get a chance to meet the man, Davon Love. But just in response to the question, just sort of halfway, or just some basic remarks. So we have this interesting fusion of or I guess the way that the knowledge of the Haitian Revolution comes to places like Maryland. So in 1793, when the northern parts of Haiti begin to fall, you're going to get 500 black people from Santo Domingo of different statuses. Some of them are free people, some of them are enslaved. One or two of them is a slave-holding person themselves. They're going to actually come into Baltimore, along with many hundreds of white people, white Santo Domingans. And in some ways, you might imagine that what we think of as black culture and black life in the city from that time forward really does shift, because they have a dramatic impact. One of the band leaders that I'm looking at this time, a guy named Captain Harris, was one of our most important musicians during the era of Harvey Johnson. His father was born in Haiti, and presumably, spoke Haitian Creole, or spoke French and Haitian Creole. And that impact, sort of came through the city, sort of through the rest of the 19th century. But in more dramatic fashion, I would say, and of course, Haiti was the example of revolutionary black success globally acknowledged after 1804. In the 1820s and 1830s in Baltimore City, they're having celebrations of Haitian independence. I have not read about an award, say, that would be given to, like, for oratory contest or something. We have a number of African schools, independent African schools in Baltimore City during that time, but they are among the intellectual class. Haiti and the success of the revolution and the revolutionary heroes is being circulated widely. Perhaps the very best example of that, and I put the thing up on there for you all about the celebration, this film that we have celebrating 200th anniversary of the church that I belong to. The founding minister, this guy, William Levington, comes from the St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. That's the foundation of black trained clergy in the United States, right? Absalom Jones is the first ordained black clergyman in the United States. Like you have to take a series of examinations to become an ordained clergy person, right? Absalom Jones is number one. So Levington is number three. He comes down to Baltimore. He's been in contact with this guy, Prince, I don't know what his last name is. He called himself Prince. His first name is Prince, who was the emissary for Henri Christophe. And so you have black American. Sometimes he would pass himself off as a person who had been born on the continent, but he's like born in Vermont or Massachusetts. He gets educated in the Northeast, and he goes abroad, works for the Haitian government. He's like a translator, ambassador, emissary, and then he comes back to sort of have a series of opportunities to become the minister at St. Thomas in Philadelphia. So anyway, Levington then comes down here and opens a school. So I'm sure that he didn't want the Philadelphians to be further along ideologically than the Baltimoreans that he came in contact with. He, of course, Levington is, we're talking about the 1830s now. Levington, of course, is very good friends with the ministers at Bethel and the ministers at Sharp Street. Now, these people, Nathaniel Peck would be one, they are making travel arrangements to investigate Trinidad and also Haiti as possible sites for relocation. So your sense of like an ideology like Pan-Africanism is going to be profoundly connected to the movement of black Americans to the Caribbean and then also to West Africa. And of course, for the Baltimore area, the most important figure combining Christianity and what we might think of as, we could say today, or I would be comfortable saying today, Pan-Africanist philosophy. A sense of black unity, but again, one that would be connected to Marcus Garvey and Africa for Africans, would be the figure Daniel Coker, who will be one of the founders of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, again in Philadelphia, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, but Maryland's Daniel Coker, right? We always have to remember, everybody had portraits of this man in their house in the 1830s, all the black religious leaders. And then Coker is going to be the head of the African school. He will then go to what is modern day Liberia in 1820. So they went back, they took advantage of the ex-migration movement. But several other figures will be key with the evolution of black territorial independence movements. And then some of them are Marylanders, like the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, who I just assume he would have had some overlap with Harvey Johnson. And then Henry McNeil Turner, prominent bishop, who I also, I don't know this, I don't know enough about Johnson, but who I also assume would have had significant overlap with Harvey Johnson. And these people, perhaps also along with Alexander Crummell, who will be in Washington, D.C. as an Episcopalian minister after having spent many years in West Africa, they will be at the forefront of, sort of putting together the philosophical and religious statements, and then also the practical kinds of communiques that will bring together a network of people who will be thinking very logically and systematically about, what is it like for us to think about moving people to another territory and potentially moving to West Africa. And of course, Martin Delany from Charleston, West Virginia will be another one of the figures. In some ways, kind of like, we're very proud of Frederick Douglass. We should always be very proud of Frederick Douglass. But in some ways, kind of like an antithesis to Frederick Douglass. Douglass always said, I was proud that...
Martin Delany said, I'm proud to be a black man.
God made me a man. Martin Delany was proud that God made him a black man. And Martin Delany, of course, leads an expedition to Nigeria and, produces a series of treaties with the certain group of the aristocracy there, and is prepared to, again, we're going to take black people to black-controlled parts of Africa as opposed to, Monrovia, which would become, like a U.S. colony. Another part of which is...
The only other part, which is the Texas Purchase, Harvey Johnson, the Texas Purchase being potentially an example of that.
I would just say, yeah, absolutely.
Martin Delany had the book Blake. I remember reading it while I was at Hopkins.
That's right. This novel that's serially published in Douglass's newspaper, where you have somebody doing what? Leading a successful slave revolt. And it's not just one that is sort of like, we're going to have an uprising and kill massa on the farm and run off, but rather we're going to connect all of the enslaved places here in the United States with those in the Caribbean. We're going to have a headquarters in Havana in Cuba. We're going to get just like the Haitians, right? Just like Toussaint, just like Christophe, not so much Jean-Jacques Dessalines. But we're going to have these partnerships with other powers, and that's how we're going to produce the terms for emancipation, global emancipation.
Are there any other questions from anyone?
Thank you.
Former colleague.
So thank you for having this conversation. Of course, I'm interested in the interplay between the Maryland General Assembly and emancipation. And I wanted to hear a little bit more, if you could, about the efforts to reverse the original 1864 Constitution. Even though there was no success in restoring slavery, there were laws that I'm sure were passed. I will call it mini restoration of slavery. Could you talk a little bit about that, or any of those efforts? Like, what stopped the reinstitution? Was it just federal, or what was it? Something else? Was there a movement that was successful, and then also the laws that were passed that did things like, I understand, and capture children and some other things? What were some of those laws?
I'm going to leave this one to the delegate, but I just would say that one of the things that came up, I wasn't thinking about this, but anyway, Kentucky and Kentucky and Delaware, I guess, they don't ratify the 13th Amendment, so, or they're like, right at the end. I mean, again, they did not want to adhere to federal national policy, saw it as encroachment on states' rights. The movement here isn't that strong, and I think there are, ultimately, at the end of the day, former Delegate Carter, there are the commercial reasons aren't powerful enough for the small group of large slaveholders to continue to emphasize the need to keep people in bondage. And also immediately, as you mentioned, these labor contracts are produced, they're coming out of the Freedmen's Bureau, right? You're supposed to be have different kinds of contracts for labor, and the children could often be involved, or you can have sort of a mandatory kind of contract that might be put in place for several years. These different kinds of legal constraints mimic the control that people were interested in, that they understood enslavement to have produced. Now, today, we would say that this is all like largely mythology, or that they were living in a fantasy, that there was so much control. But certainly, many of the social customs, by continuing so many of the social customs, they were still able to control. And of course, the Civil War also introduced so much heavy industry and nascent technologies that, I guess I think that it became more and more, it became easier to see the anachronism of field labor as a system of capital accumulation.
So I think at the time in 1867, we move away from a unionist type of a General Assembly into a more democratic General Assembly. And you have Andrew Johnson, who in that rollback of Reconstruction.
Yeah, well, he brought everybody back in as citizens.
And so they're brought back in, they dominate, and this was their efforts to kind of roll back things. And so that particular Constitution, the Constitution of 1867, is actually the Constitution that we're living under today, with numerous amendments, but that's the Constitution that they put in place today. So I mean, someone like you may wonder where, a number of the laws and things that we have, we're living under this Constitution that folk who didn't appreciate what they did in 1863 put into place that we still have today.
Many people think that the U.S. Constitution should have been formally revised at the end of the Second World War in the way that many of the European constitutions were formally revised, and that, it was by that time, right, it's an antique document that, was connected to something where there were some dimensions, that people were very proud of, but as I said, in other ways, completely reprehensible and an embarrassment relative to the ideas of modern nation-state Republican democracy.
Do you have any idea about the Civil Rights Amendments and when they were ratified by Maryland by any chance?
I can't give you chapter and verse. No, sir. No, sir. I'm sorry.
I'm just curious. Were there any? Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for this. I think this is really important. My question really is, looking ahead, is there an opportunity to use this holiday, this demarcation moment, as a way of catalyzing additional reconciliation in our state? And looking at the Truth and Equity initiative that Cincinnati did, or something to this effect, where we start to understand the true long-lasting effects of systemic racism and the way that this bondage occurred, and how to make an impact on things like home ownership in Baltimore, where 40% versus 76% for white families, things along those lines.
Well, great question. I'm always, I feel like my imagination is so limited when I have to, sort of think, panoramically, I guess. And I would just hope that we could use the moment to work on fairly narrow concerns, homeownership in Baltimore, or maybe African American homeownership generally in the state. Just throw something out. So recently, the news exposed real estate speculation in West Baltimore, like where the church attended and grew up in, baptized in a firm. Mom's married there. Our church, and what's happening is that African American communities, African American people continue to be super exploited in a way that is like it's difficult for us to imagine. I think. I personally don't think that more government regulation is exactly the answer. So I hope that there's a way that we could. I hate to use this language, but begin to have conversation. Davon has a better answer, I think, to these questions, like how can we best take advantage of this moment right now? But I would like for us to be very Douglassian on this question. If we are living in America and we are American citizens, I would like to see Black Americans as highly educated homeowners. And you can say, you're being bourgeoisie, Mr. Jackson, or the other kinds of things. But I'm still seeing those as the same bedrocks that Douglas identified in 1864. And there are ways, certainly relative to things like education, that we could have a dramatic, direct, immediate impact. But some of it has to do with our sense of will, or our will and our sense of responsibility and duty. And I think it's the best thing that the moment for Juneteenth, the moment for November 1st, that's sort of the best thing that we can do. If our brothers and sisters, Jewish American brothers and sisters, are emphatic about the statement, that we will never forget, we will never abandon something significant and deeply traumatic that's happened to us, I would say that African Americans and Americans can do no less about the fundamental trauma that's at the cornerstone of our national identity and belonging, whether we like it or not. And rather than erase it, we need to continue to use it as a catalytic moment to energize us for remedies.
Real quick, if I may, this church that we're here, it started off on Winter's Wing. So when you mentioned that in history, that was profound to me. And many of our members currently are from that area. So if you could please share that research, because I think we would love that as a part of our archive.
I will get that. We'll make a connection after this, and I will make sure.
I appreciate that. I think that was profound information, at least to me, especially. Beautifully. Thank you so much.
All right. Yes, sir.
Last night, Baltimore County, what we learned from the Department of Justice, that they had signed an MOU with the Department of Justice and Homeland Security to collaborate with ICE. And when it comes to the parallels with the federal immigration policies of the Trump administration, would be Lincoln Riley and 287G with the Fugitive Slave Act. Could you talk a little bit about how northern legislators responded to, or legislatures responded to the Fugitive Slave Act, or how populations in northern states were resisting that?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
It's like we stepped into it now. And again, I'm going to defer to things. Yeah, certainly there are some stunning parallels. And one of the things that's fascinating about if you could call it a consensus, or the emergence of the consensus among Northerners to participate in the Civil War. No war is popular. Lincoln, of course, said to Harriet Beecher Stowe that she was the person who had generated the consensus for the Civil War with the portrait of Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom's Cabin, but that this this possibility of, sort of losing their own rights, their own will and privacy was always paramount to Northerners. And as we move more rapidly towards a militarized administrative state, we all probably have our own definitions for what seems like fascism to us, or how fascism might emerge. And I'm not trying to talk about the Union or the Confederacy relative to that, kind of a 20th century term. But we can definitely, we might be beyond the place of alarm. Now, I think that there are sort of twin situations at once. Like, we have a particular kind of a financial crisis, somewhat an engineered financial crisis, like relative to national debt and how the state might perform best. And I would think, I mean, again, like I said, this is Professor Jackson as a private citizen. I'm not representing my institution. I think that that has something to do with the attractiveness of large numbers of migrant labor, regardless of political party. So that we are seeing record numbers of people arrive into the United States because it's impossible for us to function economically and financially without hundreds of thousands of people who are like working below minimum wage, or ineligible in some ways for public education, healthcare, and housing. Like I say, for me, it's this is like this is it. And then on top of that, we're seeing the emergence, or not the emergence, or the continuation, or the furthering of, like I said, an aggressive, militarized, increasingly centralized and authoritarian state. So I would not like to see it evolve into open conflict such as we had known previously, and it's been fairly consistent in our national story. So what do? We have elected
And no, thank you. And you had legislators who would pass laws. I think they were called the personal liberty laws, that essentially prohibited state officials from assisting the return of people who had run away. You had them laws passed that would guarantee jury trials for those who were accused of being runaways. I would say you certainly had the support of the Underground Railroad systems. So, I mean, you had that type of resistance. Certainly you had a lot of civil disobedience. Hence, people ended up in court fighting former or slave owners as they were attempting to get their property back. So, I mean, you had, and it was fun. Last night I was watching MSNBC, and I think Rachel Maddow, she had said or talked about how there is no silver bullet to any of this stuff. It's everybody kind of doing their thing. And even closer to home, when we have this debate about whether or not Maryland should be redistricting like everyone else is, again, everybody has to do their own thing that they're comfortable with, and what everybody does to address what's happening out of the Trump administration isn't necessarily the right thing for everybody, but everybody has to do something. So what's right for California, what's right for New York may not be right for Maryland, which is a point that I attempted to make some time ago in supporting our president in the state Senate. And he's getting a lot of pushback because people, they want to see action. I mean, I was just talking this morning, I said they want to be Old Testament Christians, an eye for an eye. But what did they say? That leaves both parties blind, right? I mean, I'm trying to be New Testament. I'm trying to treat folk how they want to be treated, how I want to be treated. So there has to be other ways of resistance here in the state of Maryland.
Let me just add, I hope that we can, that it helps us to produce a class of more virtuous politicians. Maybe that's complete what occurs to me, you don't fight fire with fire, but you fight it with water, right? And the water really does have, I think, or the antidote water would be to try to remove some of the gain that's possible from our politics. I mean, again, we tried, that was the big thing that was on the table in 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign, as one example. This is somebody who's asking for all the reforms and to remove the political contributions from the presidential campaigns, especially. And in some ways, he was also in response to these different court decisions that had unleashed, corporate money into our political system. But I think that it can come from different places, right? It can come from the religious community, it can come from the committed leftist community, it can come from other places as well. But I would like to see, I think that part of the antidote, at least in the political framework, would be the emergence of another class, another kind of politician. I don't know if this would be true per se of Mamdani in New York. It could be, but maybe we'll see, or can produce the climate, help to produce the climate that would result in another group of politicians and thinkers. Prior to the American Civil War, of course, I think it was my brother Sidney just said this, or made reference to it. You come up with really these extraordinary American writers and thinkers, but civil disobedience, is going to be written at that time. And then, my favorite out from there is like Herman Melville and Benito Cereno, and maybe we'll get another kind of revolution in areas of life that we all inhabit that will propel the successful movement that we know needs to happen.
Look, I want to say, Professor, thank you very much. There's another. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
You didn't see me?
I'm sorry.
You were talking about the reconciliation of the flag, so I'm basically declaring it, right? And so it's really interesting because what you wear is what you represent. So I've had already, before I came here, at least 3 or 4 questions. People say, oh, I like your colors, I like what you're wearing. And then I'm like, okay, let's start here. I got the flag, I got the timeline of African American history. I've got Buffalo Soldiers on the back. I got, enough said. I have my Break the Chains bracelet, and I gave away 2 Black Folks Matters buttons in the conversation. So I basically just am saying we can start in so many ways of really building up and motivating this day as being so significant, maybe just by something you wear.
Oh, no, good point. I want to thank you, Professor. I want to thank Morning Star for opening up their chapel to us. I want to thank you all for coming out today and joining us in this conversation. Happy Emancipation Day.